Ever felt like you're just drowning in information? Or, you just need that clear shortcut to really get a complex topic? We've all been there. Today, we're really getting into a fascinating, often misunderstood, and incredibly interconnected world. We're talking about autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. Now, you might already know the basics, but for this deep dive, we're focusing squarely on the profound and sometimes surprising ways they overlap.
Absolutely. And, the more we looked into the research to this, the clearer it became just how deeply connected these conditions really are. Our mission today is basically to break down why they so often co-occur, how that intertwining really impacts daily life, things like fine motor skills, sensory experiences, and also explore the crucial role of personalized help, like occupational therapy. We've basically sifted through a whole stack of research papers, clinical guides, expert insights to bring you the most important bits fast.
Okay, so before we dive into those fascinating overlaps, maybe just a quick refresher. ADHD and ASD. What are the core things we need to keep in mind for this conversation?
Of course. So ADHD, we're
Yeah.
talking about a neurodevelopmental thing, right? Characterized by persistent patterns of inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. It affects what, roughly 5 to 10% of kids around the world. And for a lot of them, those symptoms carry on into adulthood. Often shows up as challenges with executive functions, organizing stuff, staying focused, managing impulses. Then there's autism spectrum disorder. That's a complex developmental condition marked by ongoing challenges with social communication, restricted interests, and repetitive behaviors.
Okay. And what's really striking, as you mentioned, is how often they appear together. The research, it says co-occurrence is somewhere between 30% and, wow, 78%, depending on the study.
Yeah, those numbers are pretty wide, but even when you combine community and clinical studies, it's still around 21%. It's common.
So why does that co-occurrence matter so much? What's the impact?
Well, that's a really crucial point, because when these two conditions show up together, the characteristics of both can actually get more intense. This often leads to, well, bigger impacts on a person's life.
Mm.
Think about it. The social communication difficulties of autism may be combined with the impulsivity or inattention from ADHD. That creates a really unique set of challenges. Challenges that can be, frankly, much greater than either condition on its own. So getting a clear diagnosis, getting early, targeted intervention, it becomes even more critical for that person's well-being, their ability to really thrive.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's tempting to just see them as separate boxes, but the research really highlights these deep commonalities underneath. Let's explore some of those. Maybe start with genetics. What are researchers finding there?
Okay, yeah, this is where it gets really compelling. There's significant genetic overlap between ASD and ADHD. We're talking specific, tiny genetic changes. Things like protein truncating variants,
Yeah.
basically single-letter DNA shifts that mess up proteins, or copy number variants where you have extra copies of genes in certain spots. And the key thing is, these specific changes are found in both autistic people and those with ADHD. It suggests a kind of shared biological foundation.
Uh-huh.
Researchers have also found differences in the shank genes. These are really important for how brain cells, neurons talk to each other. They influence, emotional well-being, social stuff, memory, executive function, a lot.
So with that shared genetics, it's probably not surprising that heritability is a big factor, right? They both tend to run in families?
Exactly. The studies really back that up. Children whose birthing parent has ADHD, they're about 2.5 times more likely to be autistic. And siblings of autistic individuals, they're nearly 3.7 times more likely to develop ADHD. It really highlights that shared genetic thread you mentioned.
Okay, so beyond genetics, what about the brain itself? The structure, the connections? Are there commonalities there too?
Absolutely. Brain imaging studies show differences in both conditions compared to neurotypical brains, particularly in gray matter volume and signaling networks. But here's an interesting distinction. Autism is often linked with increased gray matter in some areas, like the frontotemporal region, which is involved in social function, whereas ADHD is often linked with decreased volume in other areas, like the orbitofrontal region, crucial for executive functions.
So differences, but in related ways.
Kind of. The takeaway is that different brain parts might be affected differently, but both conditions show unique structural patterns compared to typical development. And another thing, differences in the corpus callosum. That's the big bundle of nerves connecting the two brain hemispheres. It's involved in social function, motor coordination, attention, executive functions, lots of things. Lower connectivity in the corpus callosum seems to be more strongly associated with autism than with ADHD, but it's an area of difference in both.
And then there are the overlapping symptoms themselves, things that can look similar on the surface.
Right. Lots of traits can overlap. Difficulty switching attention, for example, that struggle moving from one task or focus to another. Challenges with eating or sleeping patterns, very common reports in both groups. Repetitive behaviors can show up in both, maybe for different reasons, but they're there. Atypical sensory sensitivities, huge overlap. And communication difficulties, especially with pragmatic language, the unspoken social rules of conversation.
And finally, something really important, but maybe less talked about, the impact on mental health.
Yes, absolutely critical. Both autistic individuals and people with ADHD face a higher likelihood of experiencing anxiety and depression. For ADHD, about 25% also have an anxiety disorder. And the risk of depression. It jumps like 6.5 times in the first year after an ADHD diagnosis. That's huge. Wow. And for autistic people, the numbers are significant too, around 20% diagnosed depression, another 20% anxiety. It's a heavy load that really underscores the need for, holistic support.
Definitely. So let's connect all this back to daily life. How do these conditions, especially when they overlap, specifically impact functioning? Maybe in ways we don't immediately think of.
That's a great question. And the research really shines a light on some perhaps unexpected areas, like fine motor performance.
Okay, fine motor skills. We looked at a really interesting study for this, didn't we, from southern Taiwan.
Yes, a large one. Nearly 1,900 young kids under 6, all considered at risk for developmental delays. And the key finding was pretty clear. Differences in fine motor performance do vary depending on the specific disability type.
How so?
Well, children who had an intellectual disability or multiple diagnoses like ASD and intellectual disability, or maybe ADHD comorbid with something else, they showed significant difficulty, much more difficulty with tasks needing manual dexterity, manipulating small objects, and visual motor integration like copying shapes. They scored way lower in those areas compared to kids who only had ASD or only ADHD or other unspecified delays.
Can you give us a sense of the numbers?
Yeah, to put it concretely, in one age group they looked at, over 86% of the kids with intellectual disability were flagged as at risk for motor difficulties. Compare that to about 38% of the kids with just ASD and around 29% of those with just ADHD. Big difference.
So what's the main takeaway from that for, say, clinicians or parents listening?
The study really drove home a strong link between fine motor performance and cognitive ability across all the disability types they studied in these young kids. Basically, better cognitive ability generally went hand in hand with better fine motor skills. So for pediatric clinicians, it really highlights that you need to consider cognitive ability when you're evaluating fine motor skills and planning support. It helps make the intervention more targeted, more effective.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's shift gears a bit to another area that's hugely impacted: sensory processing.
Yes, profoundly impacted for so many. Sensory processing.
Yeah.
That's just how our nervous system takes in, interprets, and then responds to all the sensory information from the world around us. And it's not just the main 5 senses, right? It also includes proprioception, your sense of where your body is in space, and the vestibular sense, which handles balance and spatial orientation.
And here's something that was a real aha moment for me when researching this. For many neurodivergent people, those processes, like filtering sensory input, they're often manual, not automatic like they are for most neurotypical folks.
Exactly. That's such a key concept.
Can you explain that a bit more? Like, what does manual filtering feel like?
Imagine being in a busy cafe. For a neurotypical person, their brain automatically tunes out the background chatter, the clatter of cups, the espresso machine hiss, focusing on their conversation. For someone whose filtering is manual, every single one of those sounds might hit their brain with equal intensity. They have to consciously work to filter it out.
Wow, that sounds exhausting.
It absolutely can be. It takes a huge amount of mental energy. And this difficulty applies across senses, tactile things, like scratchy tags on clothes, bright fluorescent lights, strong perfumes.
And this is where sensory overload comes in?
Precisely. It happens when the brain just gets swamped with more sensory input than it can effectively process at that moment. Common signs are things like intense irritability, maybe even meltdowns. Physical discomfort is a big one. Excessive fidgeting or restlessness can be a sign too, or avoiding certain activities or places altogether because the sensory input is just too much.
And when autism and ADHD co-occur, you mentioned these sensory differences can be even more pronounced.
Yes, the research suggests that. For example, sensitivity to sound might be even more disturbing or overwhelming for individuals who have both conditions compared to those with just one. The combination can amplify these sensory challenges.
Okay, so given these really complex, often overlapping challenges, what kind of support actually helps people thrive?
Well, a really important piece of the puzzle is occupational therapy, or OT. OT offers a really holistic approach and, crucially, one that affirms neurodiversity. It's about helping individuals build skills, adapt their routines, and just navigate daily life more effectively.
How does that look in practice, say in schools?
In schools,
Yep.
OTs focus on helping kids participate when there are barriers. That could be related to academics, social stuff, play, mental wellness, even self-care, like getting dressed. They might recommend changes to the environment, like different seating options, creating sensory-friendly corners in classrooms. They provide adaptive tools. And a big part is educating teachers on how to best support the child's needs within the classroom setting.
And what about for adults? Is OT still relevant?
Oh, absolutely. For adults with neurological differences like autism and ADHD, OT provides vital support. They help with sensory integration strategies like we just discussed. They address mental health, really exploring that link between anxiety, depression, and sensory experiences. They work on executive function skills, planning, organizing, managing time. Big challenges for many. Plus things like employment support, developing independent living skills. It's very broad.
You mentioned sensory integration strategies. Can you give an example, like the sensory diet?
Yes, exactly.
Hmm.
OTs trained in sensory integration can really pinpoint specific triggers for an individual. Then they recommend tailored strategies. Often this includes putting together a sensory diet, which isn't about food. It's a structured plan of activities throughout the day designed to provide the right kind and right amount of sensory input for that person's nervous system. So that might include things like deep pressure activities, maybe using a weighted blanket or lap pad, scheduling movement breaks, specific tactile activities like using therapy putty or even specific brushing protocols. It's very personalized.
Okay, OT sounds incredibly valuable. What about other effective interventions that can make a real difference?
Yeah, there are definitely other powerful approaches. Play therapy, for instance. It's strongly supported by research, especially for kids. It's child-centered. They use play to express themselves, work through emotions, build crucial life skills.
How does play therapy help with things like ADHD or autism symptoms specifically?
Well, it can really help with social skill development, things like learning turn-taking, practicing different social scenarios through role play. It can improve focus and attention, maybe through structured games like sequencing puzzles or listening games, like Simon says. It helps with emotional regulation, using things like sensory bins to calm down or puppets to tell stories about feelings. And it can reinforce positive behaviors.
And you mentioned it can even be done online now.
Yes. Which is great for accessibility. Play therapy has adapted, and online sessions can be really effective too.
What about changing the environment itself? Simple fixes.
Huge impact. Environmental modifications can significantly cut down on sensory overload. Think about using noise-canceling headphones in loud places, swapping harsh fluorescent lights for softer lamps, creating spaces that are less cluttered, maybe using calming colors, ensuring good ventilation if strong smells are an issue. These aren't small things. They could be game changers for daily comfort and function.
I feel like this next one could benefit almost anyone. Mindfulness and relaxation techniques, how do they fit in?
They're really useful for teaching individuals to notice sensory input without having that immediate, automatic, overwhelming reaction. Simple techniques like deep breathing exercises, visualization, or grounding techniques. Like the 5-4-3-2-1 method, you consciously notice 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 you can hear, 2 you can smell, 1 you can taste. It pulls you back into the present moment, away from the overwhelm.
Yeah, I've used that one. It really works. And something we keep coming back to on this deep dive, the power of routine and predictability.
Oh, absolutely essential. Many people with ADHD and/or autism, both kids and adults, really thrive on predictable routines and schedules. Knowing what's coming next reduces anxiety. So giving advance notice about transitions, like moving from playtime to dinner time or changes in the usual routine,
Yeah.
that can make a massive difference in preventing overwhelm.
Things like visual schedules can help too, right?
Definitely, especially for kids. Having a visual representation of the day's plan can be incredibly helpful. And, speaking of clarity, getting that clear, accurate diagnosis in the first place is so crucial. This isn't just one quick test. It really needs a comprehensive evaluation by a team, psychologists, pediatricians, maybe OTs, speech therapists. They gather detailed histories, family, medical, developmental, use a whole range of validated assessment tools, and observe the person in different settings like home and school.
Why is that thoroughness so important?
Well, it helps make sure symptoms aren't being double counted, attributed to one condition when they might be better explained by the other or by both. And it ensures that any other co-occurring conditions get spotted and addressed. Things like intellectual disability, maybe developmental coordination disorder, anxiety disorders. It allows for truly holistic support.
And there's one final really important point about diagnosis you raised, considering factors beyond just the diagnostic criteria.
Yes, absolutely vital. We have to be aware of non-diagnostic factors, things like a person's cultural background, their gender, and we know much less about how these conditions present in girls and women. Also, experiences of trauma, poverty, language barriers, all these things can significantly influence how symptoms present and how assessments turn out. We need to carefully consider these factors to reduce bias and make sure the diagnosis is accurate and fair. It's about seeing the whole person, not just ticking boxes on a checklist.
That's such an important perspective.
So we've really covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? We've journeyed through this really intricate landscape of ASD and ADHD, from looking at those surprising genetic links and brain differences to how they really impact things like fine motor skills and sensory experiences day to day. And we've highlighted the absolutely vital role of comprehensive support, especially OT, but also play therapy, environmental tweaks, mindfulness, routine, all those key interventions.
It's been incredibly insightful. Now, here's a final, maybe provocative thought for you, our listener, to mull over. What if we shifted our whole understanding of neurodiversity, moved away from just seeing a list of deficits, and instead started recognizing different operating systems, different ways brains work? How might really grasping that some brains manually process what others do automatically, how might that change the way we design everything, our environments, our schools, our workplaces, even just our daily interactions? How could that shift truly empower everyone to thrive?